Hey there, it's Leo from Firecrawl, and in this video, we'll be talking about our main endpoint, which is scrape. Before anything else, let me show you our documentation. This serves as a reference not only for you, but for your agent. If you want to send this as a context over to the agent, just click on copy page. The markdown for this doc should now be in your clipboard, so just send it over to Claude Code, to Codex, or any agent you're using, and it should now have full context on how to use the scrape endpoint from Firecrawl. And additionally, if you want to use a specific feature like faster scraping, just select that. There's also batch scraping, chain tracking, and much more that we will be seeing throughout the video through our playground, as well as some examples of how these endpoints perform inside of an agent. And if you want to get even more specific, head over to API reference. Here we have the scrape endpoints, which can either be the specific scrape endpoint. We have a video already on interact, which is a fallback to scrape. We also have the batch scrape endpoint that, because it's asynchronous, there's also a get batch endpoint, a cancel, and a get batch scrape errors. This is another page you can use as reference, as well as copy it for your agent. Now back to the playground. This is something I use every time I want to implement with Firecrawl, just because it's a nice reference to understand which features are available. So if I type in firecrawl.dev, I can select specific formats. And to understand how JSON works, I can just select that and click on edit options. Here, you'll see I can type in a prompt, have a schema, which I can either define as a schema or just specify an example in JSON. And this is just one example, but in here, if I say extract anything, click on save options, and then click on get code. Now I have that specific code in the exact structure I need for it to work and perform the fetch and the scrape that I initially intended, not only in Python, but JavaScript as an MCP with Firecrawl, which would mainly be about configuring the MCP and then using this prompt inside of the agent. And finally, we also have the curl request. Aside from that, we also have specific options, and this is all listed in the playground, so it's easy to remember which feature. You can also do the first scrape here to understand if it works, and then if it does, just grab the code, click on get code, send that context over to the agent so that it could build what you want, or just go ahead and build it yourself. All right, so first let's go through the options. The first option we have available here is main content only. This makes it so that Firecrawl ignores the navbar, the footer, and makes it so that if, for example, you're searching for a blog, it's only grabbing the content, since the context from navbar from the footer wouldn't be necessary in this case. Now let's go over parse PDF. This is especially important for agents when they encounter a specific URL that is a PDF. What would it do in that specific case? If it understands that it has a parameter that allows it to read that PDF, then it just basically toggles that on and allows you to read that specific PDF. So PDF parsing isn't that easy if you do it yourself. PDF processing at scale, especially serving it over to agents, can become a bit tricky, but with the scrape endpoint, it allows you and your agent to have access to those PDFs. You can actually have the scraper go through Excel spreadsheets in these extensions, as well as Word documents in these. Our default mode is auto, so it should try to parse it as fast as possible. If it doesn't work, then it falls back to forcing OCR parsing. All right, now for enhanced mode, let's look at the documentation that explains exactly what it is. Essentially, we have three different types. For basic, it's a standard proxy suitable for most websites. This is the default. Actually, the default is auto, but the auto mode basically tries basic first and then retries with enhanced. So it's smart enough to understand if the basic was sufficient or if it needs to then try with enhanced. As for enhanced, it basically uses a better proxy and is therefore slower, but should perform better. All right, now as for exclude tags and include tags, if you specifically want to remove the footer for whatever reason, you could just add hashtag footer if the footer is defined from the ID, or if there's a class you want to ignore, you just add the dot class. Same thing for include tags. So if you specifically want to get the footer, just add the specific ID for that footer. And notice that not all websites might have a specific hashtag footer as the ID for their footer. So make sure to check that out before adding the include tag section. All right, now as for the wait option, this is essentially for slower websites. And if you want Firecrawl Scraper to wait a few seconds before trying to effectively scrape that website, in this field, you can actually write 5 seconds. And as for the time timeout. This is the maximum time you want to allow Firecrawl to go inside of the website and retrieve the information. If it goes beyond that amount, then you get a timeout on that. Now, the max age input is very, very interesting. There's a lot of options, which I want to go through from our documentation. With it, you're basically defining a specific range of time where you want the results to come from. I honestly don't think I phrased that in the best way, but just look at the default freshness window. If you have a max age of 2 days, this means that our scraper can look inside of our cache to try to find that page you're looking for, because if it's already cached, then the response can come back in up to 500% faster. But in some cases, you want the information to come in fresh. For example, if you're searching for news, ideally you'd want that specific blog page to have a fresh result. And if so, you can just set the max age to 0. Additionally, you can also do a cache only lookup. So by setting the minimum age, which isn't a parameter we can find inside of the playground, but here in the API reference, it is listed right next to max age. When using it, you're basically performing a cache only lookup without triggering the fresh scrape. By setting that minimum age to 1, you're basically accepting any cache data regardless of the age. So this would ideally mean you're aiming for the fastest scrape possible without really worrying if the data is updated or not. All right, now we've gone through the options. Let's check batch scraping. When you open up this model, what you can do is type in a bunch of different websites. So let me add Firecrawl, resend.dev, and supabase.com. All right, now as you can see, there are default columns. So company name, company description, we can actually alter that, but let's stick with them and select all of these different URLs, then click to enrich all of them. What this is doing is using the Firecrawl batch scrape to search and retrieve all of the information to you at once. So that's basically it. Everything came in, and it doesn't require us to implement this parallel execution of a single scrape endpoint. And by the way, if you're using Firecrawl inside of your coding agent, you might not see a Firecrawl batch scrape, just the scrape. But that's basically because, and this is kind of a dumb comparison, but people understand it when I mention this. What if you could open many different terminals and have each terminal execute a different scrape? This is what you can just tell your agent to do so it handles scraping in parallel. So this is my prompt. Get me the first 5 blog posts from Firecrawl, then scrape all of them in parallel. Then get me a summary. So the first thing it did is understand it has a Firecrawl map. The map basically gets all of the links from a specific page, which is the Firecrawl blog page. And now it just executed inside of the bash many different scrape for all of these different URLs. Everything was already retrieved and written to the file system. So all of those markdowns can be found right here. All this isn't added to Claude Code's context window, by the way. It is stored here, and Claude can go inside of that file and find only what it needs to then produce the summary, for example. All right, so that's how you can batch scrape. And now let's check formats. The first format is Markdown, which is exactly what we just checked. So if we head back to our file, this is the structure that comes back to us, which is extremely valuable to LLMs. Since it doesn't have many HTML tags, for example, that would bother the agent's context window. Following that format, we have summary, because sometimes your agent doesn't need to grab the entire context from a blog page. So what I can tell it to do is scrape it again, but use the summary format, not Markdown. All right, now it's sent off all of those scrapes with summary. So instead of getting that huge Markdown, all we get is the summary already done from Firecrawl's side. You'll see me repeating this word over and over during the video, but context. This is gold for an agent's context. Okay, now the formats for links is pretty intuitive. If you define a link as the format, and let's scrape firecrawl.dev, that should be done, and we get all the links that it finds inside of that page, which is actually very similar to map. Then we have HTML format, either cleaned or a raw HTML response. And this is the most basic format of scraping, nothing too special here. But then we get to the screenshot format, which I personally really enjoy. You can either use the viewport or full page. Viewport is exactly what we're seeing right now. If I select this, let's hit start scraping, and the screenshot response is exactly this section of the page. If I were to select full page, I'd get the complete and entire page inside of the screenshot. Jonathan, also known as Developer Digest, suggested adding this to OpenScouts. OpenScouts was a project where people could add a specific request and have Firecrawl's agent browse until it finds that specific event. Now, while it's processing things, having this screenshot show up so people feel or at least have the sense that something is being done done is a very smart move that Jonathan suggested and really took the usability for that product to another level. All right, now we got a sneak peek of how the JSON format works at the beginning of the video. Here I can type something like list the pricing plans. And then for the schema, let me delete this first one. Let me make this an array. The name of this array should be pricing plans, and it is an array of objects which contains plan name and plan price. The plan price should be a number. Let's save the option, then hit start scraping. All right, that was pretty quick. And now this is the output. It is exactly in the structure that we expected. So plan name, the plan for hobby is line, standard, 47, growth, and further on. Now, one thing that came to my attention while scraping for prices is that depending on the region you're scraping for, that price will have a different currency. So that's why sometimes you'll get a mismatch with what you're seeing and what's being scraped. And to ensure that you're scraping exactly based on what you expect, you can define a location. This is also not in the playground, but it's a parameter of location that you can assign a country as well as the specific language. And while we're here, I also remembered we have a mobile parameter. So on the screenshot format, for example, you can set mobile true and receive a screenshot of how the website looks like from your phone. All right, so finally we got to the branding format. We have other videos on this specific format, but it's really simple. As soon as you have it as a format, what it fetches for is the entire branding for that given website. The logo, favicon, OG image, it retrieves the primary color, secondary, understands what is the font and how is the typography. Finally, it understands forms from spacing, so the base unit, border radius, and it also understands the personality of that website, so the tone, the energy, and which audience it was built for. This should overall help you design your own website, not to look exactly like another website, but be inspired from that website in these specific parameters. Now, last but not least, we have images. With images similar to links, it retrieves all of the images found in any given website. So here's an example of images found in the firecrawl.dev website. If you click on it, you'll see it redirects you over to that specific image URL. All right, that is it for this video. We often implement new features and update old ones, so make sure to subscribe to the channel to be always up to date. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Till then.